we've seen just an intense amount of activity going on in the church in Europe. An intense military and political activity, intense spiritual activity, and intellectual activity. And the church now has built itself up, but is going to suffer, unfortunately, a big fall in our next time period of weak leaders and schism. We'll talk about that when we convene in our next session.
What were some of the main themes of this time period, this lesson that we covered? Crusades. Yeah, we hit some of the Crusades. The lesson. Yep. Yeah, heresies. And then we had right at the very end, we're talking about some important scholars, hence the Crusaders and Scholars time period. So, yeah. Interesting stuff about the Inquisitors and Inquisition, huh? Is that a different perspective than what you've heard before?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. It seems like most of society, most of our history classes and things like that are geared towards, look what horrible things the church did. And, certainly anytime someone is put to death, that's a bad thing, that's a failure. But putting it in the perspective of the time and what the church was trying to accomplish and how they were trying to accomplish it, it's not quite the same story as what we were told through our history classes. So that's why, just another example of why I really enjoy learning about church history from, sources that are familiar with our church as opposed to those who are not familiar or opposed to. So I find this stuff very interesting.
Yeah. I've never heard it said before, but we were trying to rescue souls from heresy.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty awesome. Because I was told by Protestant friends growing up and so forth that we were seeking people out to take them out, and so forth. But we were trying to rescue them from heresy.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you hear it that way, because the mission was not to go find heretics, root them out and torture them and kill them. It was the exact opposite. It was a medicinal effect. It was, let's find them so we can right them and bring them back into full communion with the church. So it's a loving act, which is exactly what our church, which is a loving mother, is supposed to do. It's to bring people back into communion with Christ. So, okay, well, let's go over some of the questions here. We've got a couple minutes, so take 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll do that. And we've got a total of 8, so I'll assign you 4, and then depending on the time, then I'll cover the last 4. But if you all want to do question 1, question 2, question 3, and then question 4, and so just go over those, and then we've also got the answers on page 151. So when you're done, page 151 is where it starts, where the answers start. Let's see, if you want these, what's that? 57. Yeah. So go ahead and look over your question, and then we'll get back together in a couple minutes to discuss. there's an appendix area, and it's got some good information in there that you may periodically want to review. For example, on page 202, we've got major heresies and schisms by time period, and so that goes for a couple pages, and you'll see in there the one we talked about today, Albigensianism, also known as Catharism, and it's got a short explanation of there. It's got a time period on there, and it talks about who responded and how the church responded. So we've got Dominicans and the Inquisition, and then there was the Albigensian Crusade. On the next page after that, it starts the 21 ecumenical councils of the church, and you can go through there and see how the councils occurred. And during this time period, of course, we had the 4 Lateran councils, and then the councils of Lyon, and it's got who was involved in that. It's got what the heresy was that was being addressed and what the teaching of the church is. When you go a little bit further, you see it's got a map of the spread of Islam, which is kind of helpful to see how Islam spread and why the Crusades came about. Because again, all of those areas were Christian originally, and then the Muslims were the ones who actually crusaded and came in between 622 and 750 AD, and that was what caused the Christian response with the Crusades. Then after that, you've also got a chronology of the Crusades, which begins on page 209, and that covers the Crusades that we talked about. And what's interesting, there were actually other Crusades that he didn't talk about in there, and it briefly mentions some of them as well. For example, the Children's Crusade, and then of course you've got the Albigensian Crusade, but it's got some extra information in there which might be helpful if you're ever curious about that. And then a map of the reclaimed Holy Land with the Crusader states. So all good information, stuff you may want to take a look at some point. So, okay, but going back to our questions, so back over on my page here. So starting with question number 1. So we had the relationship between church and state has at times been quite tenuous. During this time period, England becomes the battleground between church and state. What happened and how was the conflict resolved? So do you all have any thoughts on that?
King Henry wanted to have more power over the church. He wanted some priests that they murdered someone or something. He wanted to have them tried. He had his friend Thomas Becket of Canterbury. That was a good time to get him in there, Archbishop. And so he made him there, thought he would be his friend. Instead, he said no, and a big conflict. And in the end, Thomas Becket had to flee, comes back again, still trying to fight for the independence of the church, and was murdered.
So, yeah, kind of an interesting saga there that has been covered in movies and things like that. So, good. Okay, and question number 2. The history of the church and Western civilization were profoundly influenced by the arrival of St. Francis and St. Dominic. Who were these holy men? What impact did they have on the church and the world? And who is your favorite and why? Any thoughts on that?
Well, my favorite is another saint.
Out of those 2.
Well, first of all, I sort of summarize Francis. St. Francis was sort of going out for individual souls versus St. Dominic, who was more of a scholar perhaps and going after heresies.
Right.
And so in the end, obviously, they both wanted to save souls, but the approach was somewhat different in the process. I would say that, in fact, between, I would say St. Francis. With all due respect to St. Dominic, I want to be struck down by it.
I don't think he'd be too upset. Yeah, I think it's interesting because you can see a different approach there, but obviously both holy men, both men who loved Christ and wanted to go out and love their neighbor, So it's kind of an example for all of us because, there's so many ways that we can live our lives to be saintly. There's no set format. It's not everyone has to do it this way. So everything, you've got St. Dominic has one approach, St. Francis has another. St. Thomas Aquinas, which we see him later, he's another. And all of them are saintly and holy, but they're called in different ways by God to do different things. And that's a great example for us. So good job on that. Thank you. Okay, and question 3. One historian calls Frederick II the Crusader without faith. Who was Frederick II? What was his relationship with the church?
Ironically, he was, his parents died at the age of 4, and he was under the guardianship of the church, but it sounds like he lived a life of being a church agitator more than anything else. He was supposed to go on the 5th Crusade. He delayed and delayed, and finally went on his own, established a truce, I guess, with the Muslim leader, Al-Kamil, that allowed the Christians to go to Jerusalem, with the exception of the Temple area and the Dome of the Rock. That lasted for 10 years. But anyway, it sounds like he was basically spent a lifetime agitating the church more than anything else.
Yeah.
And he was excommunicated when he did these crusades, so he really wasn't part of the church when he did it.
Yeah, kind of an interesting character.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
He died excommunicated, I mean, there
Twice.
was no.
yeah, I think he died excommunicated. I have never come across anything that said he came back into the church that I remember. So, quite an interesting life. And, he pointed it out in the video, but a skeptic, that's really what he was. And he was sympathetic to the Islamic faith. And his bodyguard was Islamic, so very interesting character. Yeah. Okay, great. And question 4. In contrast to Frederick II, King St. Louis IX of France is called the perfect crusader. Who was St. Louis IX, and why is he considered the perfect crusader?
He was a great family man, a very devout Catholic, loved the church. He had a tremendous military mind. He preached the crusade that won over many followers. And he went to Jerusalem. Then I got confused. Did he go to Egypt first and then Jerusalem?
Yeah, Egypt was kind of the base of operations.
That's where he went first.
And then, yeah.
And then he went to
then
Jerusalem.
He was back Jerusalem from there.
Yeah, he was captured in Egypt and paid for his ransom, and then he was captured in 1250. And then he ultimately stayed in the Holy Land for 6 years. And then he went on the 8th Crusade to Tanzania in 1270, and in 1270 he died of he just died of sickness.
Mhm.
And his last words were Jerusalem on his lips.
Yeah, Jerusalem was always on his mind and
Yeah.
in his heart. So, but yeah, he was obviously he's a saint, so the church recognizes the good that he did, and he's referred to as the perfect crusader. So,
I think the cathedral in New Orleans is named after him. I believe it's St. Louis I'm pretty sure it's St. Louis IX.
interesting.
They have
yeah.
a big portrait of him.
I don't know, but
Yeah, I'm
That's very well
pretty
could be.
sure.
so interesting. Okay, and so real quick, the remaining questions here. The next one is, what is heresy and what are its effects on the church and society? Obviously, that was important here, talking about the Inquisition. So the Catechism, number 2089, defines heresy as the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine Catholic faith. So, interesting part about that, which he pointed out there, the Inquisition and the Inquisitors didn't have any jurisdiction over someone who wasn't a baptized member of the church. So again, it goes to the point about it wasn't like the church was going out and saying, let's find anybody who's not a Christian and put them on trial and execute them. It wasn't like that at all. They didn't even have the ability to do anything to someone who was a practicing Jew or Muslim or another faith. So kind of a different perspective on that. Question number 6, the church launched a crusade against the Albigensian heretics in southern France in the 13th century. What were the beliefs of the Albigensians and how was the heresy eradicated? So again, the Albigensians had kind of a neo-Gnostic belief. The soul was good, the body was bad. They believed in kind of a dualistic God. There was a God of light and a God of dark. And so the church obviously fought against that. Originally, the Pope called a crusade, and there was a crusade that went and fought against that, but ultimately that wasn't effective. The Inquisitors came in, however, and did end up eradicating Albigensianism. And then it was also codified in it was the Third Council. In fact, I could look in here, the Third Council, Lateran Council, where it talks about Albigensianism, and again goes over that and defines it as non-orthodox belief. So then we'll move into question 7. Like the Crusades, the Inquisition is one of the most misunderstood and maligned events in church history. Explain the creation of the medieval inquisitors and describe the procedures used by the inquisitors, and were they just? We talked briefly about that, but again, the Inquisition was not at all the way it seems to be portrayed in modern society and history. It was set up as a way to bring about conversion in a medicinal way, as opposed to a punitive, we're going to go out and hunt people down type of way. So very interesting perspective on things when you actually get the real history of it here. And then just moving into the last one so we can wrap up. What is scholasticism, and who are the main proponents, and what was its effect? And so scholasticism, it's a method of learning with the investigation of knowledge as the prime goal, and it seeks to integrate theology, philosophy, and sacred scripture. And we talked about some of the important people. St. Anselm was the one who was kind of the founder of that. And then you also have St. Bonaventure, St. Albert the Great, and then St. Thomas Aquinas was probably the highest or most well-known of these scholastics. So that covers the lesson for today. Looking forward to seeing you next week. And just a reminder that the lesson will be at 2:30 to 3:45 next week, so it'll be before the 4 p.m. Mass as opposed to after. Same place.
Thank you.
Thanks again, and we'll see you all next week.
All right.